Let's pivot to our third speaker today, and this is Hetali Lodaya from Legal Aid of North Carolina. And their talk is titled Jainism, Compassion, and Systemic Racism. Jains can't really know where we're going unless we know where we've been. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me okay? Awesome. Let me know if there's any issues because my headphones have been giving me difficulty these days. JJ and there, everyone. My name is Hetali. I use she, her pronouns. I am really excited to have been invited to do this today and really excited to be going after Ankit and Pratik. I'm hoping that there's actually some things that I talk about that will resonate with what they have shared. So I just want to share a couple of introductory ideas before I get into this. So Jonathan mentioned that I work at Legal Aid. So I'm an attorney for generally low-income folks here in North Carolina, helping with civil legal aid needs. I was involved with YJA or Young Jains of America for a little over a decade. And I think those experiences of learning about my faith and what it means to me in community with many other young people from all over the country of all different backgrounds really influenced a lot of how I came to some of these understandings and where I come at this from. A couple disclaimers. I am really lucky to have been exposed to a lot of these ideas and thinkers and concepts through graduate school, through my experiences teaching young people through bachelor or Jain religious classes. But I'm not somebody who has been doing this for decades. I think we've all cited really great speakers, other folks that we would suggest that you read if you are interested about something that we've spoken about today. And the second that, it's so awesome that we're all getting to speak about this a little bit. I'm grateful to have these 15 minutes, and this is an ongoing process. These things are not something that can be solved in 15 minutes, and so I really encourage you to keep thinking about these issues. And some really basic concepts, which I think have been touched on, but the ones that are important for what I'm talking about right now. Compassion and nonviolence or ahimsa, I think these are some of the core concepts of Jainism, right? They're the things that if you're asked to do like a 30-second, what is this, or really encapsulate the main teachings of Jainism, those are the two in speech, in thought, and in action that you'll probably mention. Another basic concept that I just want to highlight that I think comes up fairly regularly, again, in that basic, like, how do we think about Jainism as a faith tradition, as a spiritual tradition, is largely framing spiritual progress as a solitary pursuit, right? That at the end of the day, the things that are within our control are our actions and the choices that we make. And that as kind of the framework for how you think about, where you get to where you're going to go spiritually. And so that might create some sort of mental tension or mental confusion between this idea of, okay, spiritual progress means, I need to be reading, I need to be thinking, and I need to be meditating, versus some of what I spoke about. Maybe that comes to things like compassion and nonviolence. How does that square with protest or with, giving to others, with charity, with speaking out about things that you see that are unjust in the world? There's a tension inherent there. I think everything that's on this slide in one way or another is something that is spoken about, taught about, encouraged in Jainism, but then how do you kind of reconcile that uh, tension between solitary pursuit and community involvement? And I want to get at that first from the perspective of thinking about, again, some core concepts that Ankit and Pratik have gotten into, specifically racism and systemic inequality, and how that then ties into Jain teachings. And I also want to preface by saying that I'm also based in the United States, so a lot of the examples that are in here come from a US lens or frame, but I think they're pretty broadly applicable. So starting again with some basic definitions, what is racism? Um, there's a lot of concepts that could go into this: discrimination, prejudice, and there's not necessarily agreement among scholars about a one definition of racism. So I'll offer two. One, belief that racial differences produce inherent superiority of a particular race. And two, this idea of prejudice plus an institutional power that comes with a prejudice that gives weight or meaning to the actions that you might take. And what I hope you notice about both of these is that both of these means more than just having bad feelings about someone else because of their race. They're about thinking that you are better than someone else, or about using power to benefit one group in a way that hurts another group. And I'll say more later on, but you might be able to think about some examples or ways in which you might have experienced racism yourself. You might know someone who has, and you might also be able to think about the reasons that Jainism might say that, racism is not a good thing. It's not okay. You might have also heard the term anti-racism, or you might be asking this question, well, if I don't want to be racist, then kind of what's my other options? And again, there's no one definition, but I'll offer one from a book by scholar Ibram X. Kendi, which is, that to be anti-racist is to think that nothing is behaviorally wrong or right or inferior or superior with any racial group. So this definition also has two parts: a belief and then an imperative to take actions that are based on that. And Kendi frames this as the difference between being not racist and being anti-racist. If you're not racist, you may not be committing any of that violence or prejudice towards others, but you might be allowing it by omission. Being anti-racist means being willing to take actions to stop that violence happening around you. And that could feel a little abstract, so I want to give a couple examples. What does it look like when racism, when a combination of prejudice and power plays out in society? And you may have heard some of these before, you may not have, so I'll just give some examples. The first is systemic inequality. So imagine these ideas about some races being better than others existing not just within individuals, but within the broader fabric of society, in the policies of government, in the ways that we distribute social services, in our companies, in our workplaces. This could be in the form of laws that discriminate against a group of people or that disproportionately affect a particular group of people. It can be the result of historic practices that have long-term effects, and I'll give a more in-depth example. Another example of racism in day-to-day society is microaggressions. If systemic inequality is equality, is happening at the societal scale, microaggressions are things that happen in day-to-day interactions. And if anyone's ever made an assumption about you because of your racial identity or said things like, where are you actually from? Or do you speak Hindu? Those are examples of microaggressions. Stereotyping is a related idea, thinking that, all people from a race look the same or act the same way or have the same good or bad qualities. And the last of these probably feels very concrete to us, as a concept related to Jainism. Racism can lead to violence in thoughts and in words and in actions, and we've seen some of that. I would say it's now been almost like 10 years that some of these concepts and ideas and issues have come more to the top of our societal discourse. All of these concepts are interrelated, and they all build on each other, and understanding how and why is a continuous process. And I want to provide some starting points for further understanding this, again, particularly in the United States. And this is where I'm getting into we cannot know where we are going if we do not know where we've come from. And particularly if you didn't grow up here or learn history in our school system, there's a lot of context and background information that I can really only scratch the surface on right now. I'll just try to give two particular examples. And I think everything that I'm speaking about, as Pratik kind of mentioned, there's flavors and versions of this that can happen to any group that is being marginalized in some way, shape, or form. The two um, examples that I'm going to offer are ones that have specifically affected the Black community in the United States. The first is the origins of organized policing in the United States. So the first organized police forces, um, you know, we're not kind of neighborhood watches or privately hired security guards or things like that. They were groups of men that were brought together in the South in the early 1700s to monitor slave populations and to catch runaway slaves. And that starting point, gives us more context for the legacy of what policing looked like in this country today and the disproportionate negative effects and violence that our organized police system has on the Black community. The second example is redlining. So in the early 1930s, there was a federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation that was basically asked to make maps of cities that outlined low risk versus high risk neighborhoods to offer loans and mortgages. And these maps physically delineated cities, outlining areas in green that were more desirable and red that were highest risk, which is where we get the term redlining. So this is Durham, North Carolina's loan security map that was made in 1937. And the neighborhoods that were outlined in red were generally what we would call more quote unquote inner city neighborhoods. And they were generally predominantly Black. So private real estate agents and banks would later use these maps to steer Black families away from certain neighborhoods or make it impossible for them to get loans in certain neighborhoods. And over time, because of the way that we fund different services in this country, redlined communities tended to get less investment, lower property values. That means those communities didn't collect as much in property taxes. And property taxes fund at the local level fund schools, fund social services, the other things that you need for safe and happy and healthy communities. And so that's an example of systemic racism. It didn't require, and nobody is arguing that all of the people involved in that process were sort of overtly racist or were acting with a racist mindset. But the system that they were operating within was, and it led to an inequitable outcome that has effects even today. And this is not all in history. This is not all in the past. As a concept, I also just want to throw out that issues of politics and policy in this country, not just under this administration, under any, involve making choices about where resources do or don't go. What members of society are we choosing to support, and who are we leaving to fend for themselves? Who is considered more or less valuable as a part of our communities and societies? And actions that are taken without an understanding of the historical roots of how we got to where we are today, or without an understanding of the systemic implications of particular decisions, cause harm. So, when traffic stops or detentions in the name of immigration enforcement happen informed just by someone's last name or the language that they speak rather than by concrete information, that ignores a really rich history of immigration and migration to this country and information about why somebody might be here. When Social Security offices are closed, leaving rural Americans without easy access to the folks who can help them make sure that they get appropriate benefits in a timely manner, that affects people's healthcare, people's daily living. That choice guarantees that are going to be people who suffer violence and suffer harm to their health and well-being. So I've given a lot of examples, and you might be, we are 2/3 of the way in, and you might be asking, what in Jainism confers any affirmative obligation on any of us to do anything about this? Like, even if I learn about these things, why do I need to have this background to speak up, to call elected officials or go to protests? Like, what does any of that have to do with spiritual progress? And touching on that connection that I see between these issues and Jainism, that's really rooted in compassion. Ankit already mentioned, Mahavir Bhagwan said that we're all equal, and he specifically spoke out about the kinds of discrimination that he saw at the time that he was teaching: caste-based discrimination and gender-based discrimination, right? And specifically his redefinition of the community of the Sangh to become a fourfold community that included sadhvis, that included lay women. That was looking at the context that he was in and saying, this system as it is, these practices as they are causing harm that is not in line with our spiritual progress. And Jainism has to adapt. We're taught that we have to take Jainism's teaching and apply them to our lives, to the time that we are in. The communities and societies that we're in today are much different, and much less homogenous than the ones in which Myra Bhagwan was teaching, but both have aspects of inequality and discrimination that we know he spoke out against. And so the thesis that I'll kind of put to you brings together those concepts. If we're choosing to be lay people, if we know that our practice of religion is going to happen in the context of community and not solitude, we're not, taking vows, we're not choosing to remove ourselves from the community of lay people, we cannot fully practice nonviolence and compassion towards others in our community in the way that Myra Bhagwan taught without an understanding of these issues that we've discussed. And our best intentions towards others are going to fall flat if we don't know our history and we don't speak up about decisions that are being made that will cause harm to others. And yes, I acknowledge that these decisions, these things that I'm talking about have to do with the material world. But if we're living in the material world as lay people anyway, to ignore that violence and suffering being experienced by others, to my mind, is too narrow an interpretation of spiritual practice and what it means to live a compassionate life. And Ankit mentioned it. We already have a tool to start doing that in Jainism, the idea of anekantvad and considering other points of view. So to me, all of this connection is where that spiritual responsibility comes from, to learn more about what's going on around us and to engage actively in these kinds of conversations and actions. And I know I'm a little over, so I will wrap up really quickly. I'm sure at this point everyone is tired of seeing this cartoon, but I'm going to put it on the screen again anyway. What is the difference between equity and equality? So equality, as you can see from this first picture, is treating everyone the same or giving them the same things. Hopefully this conveys why sometimes that doesn't quite cut it. And equity, by contrast, says that we want to achieve a particular outcome where everyone has equal opportunity. As you can see, that might mean that someone needs more support or love or resources or compassion than another, at least until some societal structures or barriers are more fundamentally changed. And at the end of the day, as Ankit and I think Pratik both said, that's actually where we're trying to go, liberation, right? A space where everyone has the ability to be their desired personal and spiritual self. And when Myra Bhagwan said every living being is equal, what I will propose to you is that that's not the same thing as saying that everyone should be treated equally. It means that we are all equally deserving of dignity and compassion and respect. And we cannot understand what it means to treat people with dignity, compassion, and respect without having some understanding of history and context. And so the true practice of nonviolence is not just practicing these concepts as an individual in kind of our own bubble, but creating dialogue about having a more compassionate and nonviolent society. That's the kind of society where every living being is equal, is when we are approaching how we interact with others in an equitable way. And that's about what I have, and I am really excited to hear from others.